All right, welcome back, political economy students. I hope you had a good break from school. I'm recording on Palm Sunday, so hopefully you had. I know it's weird not going to mass, but hopefully you were able to watch uh, Palm Sunday. I really missed it actually. Just I know it's a long mass, but um, you know, the getting the palms and having the congregation participate in the readings. Definitely missed that part of it, but hopefully, hopefully you can get back to normal pretty soon. So anyway, so we're back at it. This is the last week that we'll be dealing with Adam Smith. After that, we're going to be moving on to Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics. So looking forward to that portion of the class. And now that we've got this theoretical underpinning under us, which is, I think, important to understand some of these concepts. So anyway, here's the game plan for the week. So this lecture is on page 290 to 301 in the Essential Adam Smith, and we're going to be looking at the courses on political economy, and we've been dealing a lot with economy. Now we're dealing a little bit more with politics. So this is, Smith is famous for a lot of things: the invisible hand, free trade, comparative advantage, all of that. But some of these political topics that he takes on are fascinating, actually. And this first um, topic of the proper role of government in society and what the government should and should not do is something that I think Adam Smith is pretty famous for. He is certainly an advocate of limited government. He is not an advocate of no government. He's not an anarchist, and when he thinks the government has a role, he wants the government to do it well. So he wants good government, but he also wants limited government, and he would argue that one are the same. That sometimes there are very, very important functions that you want the government to perform, and if the government is trying to do too much, it's not a he's not biased against government, but he feels that if the government is if it's spread too thin, it's not actually going to be able to perform the vital functions that we want it to perform. Okay, you're also going to hear a little some echoes of Locke with Smith in terms of what he thinks the proper role of government should be. So listen in for that. So that's right now. And then, of course, we have two sessions on Monday. So the second lecture for Monday is pages 302 to 311. And this is also very fascinating. He's going to be talking about education, and particularly as a private school. You'll be very interested to hear what he has to say about what the state should be up to in terms of providing for funding education at all levels, whether it's working class, middle class, upper class, all of that. Remember, he is a educator by training. He was at the University of Glasgow and Edinburgh, and so he's an academic, a professional academic, in a way that a lot of other our thinkers that we've listened to this year were not. So he actually has some interesting things to say about teachers and schools. So that's for the second session today, and then on Tuesday we're going to finish up page 311 to 320, and here he's going to have a lot to say about taxes and debt, um, particularly the debt. I'm pretty sure that Adam Smith would come back and just be horrified at the amount of public debt that we have, and of course we just incurred a lot more because of this economic bailout that we just passed. So he would have some interesting things to say about that. So that gets us to Tuesday, and then one of the new wrinkles for the program for the rest of the year is that the last session of class for each in the week is going to be a live Zoom session. So the thought there is that try to have an opportunity to have some participation, allow students to ask questions about any of the topics that we've put forth. Um, Also, just kind of fun to see everybody, and also increase perhaps accountability. You know, these lectures are required. I know that I've heard through the grapevine that some people are either not watching them or just hitting fast forward and just blipping through bits and pieces of it. You know, the teachers are working very hard to kind of keep education going. So these are requirements, and so we want you to listen to them. They are to complement whatever the reading or the stuff that the homework that you're doing otherwise. And we also want you to do the Google Forms assessments associated with the lectures. And this is in addition to any other assignments that you might have. And speaking of that, so on Wednesday, I want to do a review of the entire Wealth of Nations. So come loaded for bear in terms of questions that you might have. And really, the best way to review is to look at those questions that we've already answered in those Google Forms assessments. So I'm going to give you a take-home assignment very similar to the one that I gave you for theory of moral sentiments. So you'll do that. It's take-home, open book. Look for the answers. I'll expect a little bit more diligence and specificity in terms of these questions. So then when we come back, Friday is, we don't have class on Thursday in this class anyway, but Friday there's no school because of Good Friday, and no lectures on Monday because of Easter Monday. We're going to stick with the schedule that we had. And so our next class in this particular course is next Tuesday. And next Tuesday, so I want you to finish up that test. I might give you till Wednesday to do that, just because I think there'll probably be some work that you'll need to do on that. So let's make that due Wednesday. But then on Tuesday, we'll actually crack open Soul and do a lecture on that. And then Wednesday, we'll be back with a live session. So I think for that one, I'll actually think about trying to maybe do a PowerPoint or something like that to help kind of introduce some of these more technical and mathematical concepts of economics to you. All right, so that's the game plan for tonight, for Monday, and then for the rest of the next few weeks. Okay. Okay, so let's dive in, as they say. So here's the questions that I'd like for you to ponder and be able to answer as we're going through the reading. And again, this is starting on page 290, Book 5 of the Revenue of the Sovereign or Commonwealth, Chapter 1 of the Expenses of the Sovereign, basically the government. Okay? So first question is, according to Smith, what are the 3 duties of government that he discusses in the reading for today's lecture? So there's more than just 3, but in these 12 pages, what are 3 duties of government? Second question, how does Smith describe the development of the needs and provision of national defense as societies move from simple to complex organizations? How does the task and features of national defense change? So for a lot of these functions of government and duties of government that are supposed to be paid for by government, he walks us through kind of a quick little history lesson of almost like an anthropology. Like, okay, how did societies, hunters, gatherers, how did they deal with a particular topic like national defense? Then how did shepherds do that? How did agricultural societies do that? And then how does more opulent and commercial societies do it? So he's kind of walking us through kind of historical development in each of these areas. He says, third question, for Smith, what rendered civil government and civil justice necessary? What are the 4 cases of subordination related to this relationship, and how are they different in hunter, shepherd, and opulent societies? Fourth question, what are some examples of public works that Smith identifies as facilitating commerce in general? So that's a third aspect of duty of government is public works. And then finally, what are some of the problems that Smith identifies when a joint stock company, and the one that he has got on his mind is the British East India Company. When that kind of company is granted a temporary monopoly or a permanent one, as they say, and begins performing duties that are properly those of government. Like Burke, he is not a fan of these monopolists, joint stock companies that have cut sweetheart deals with the government. Okay, so those are the questions that we want to be able to answer after the text and listening to the lecture. Okay, all right. So question number one, it's the first one. Obviously, is national defense. So that's the first duty that Smith identifies as the proper role of government. And that's if you think about the U.S. Constitution, for example. It's in the preamble, provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare. So the defense is first and foremost, right? And then you look at Article 1, and Congress has the power to declare war and fund armies and navies, and the president is the commander in chief, and so that's certainly something, and the Constitution is being written at the same time that Smith is writing this book. So again, he's going to take each of these duties of government, and then he's going to look at them from the perspective of a hunter-gatherer society, a shepherd society, an agricultural or more sedentary, stationary society, and then a more opulent society. And so, in the case of national defense, if you're a hunter or a gatherer, let's say like you're the Sioux, and you're following those buffalo herds, every man is a warrior, and that's his point on page 290. Such as we find it, every man is a warrior as well as a hunter. And in the same way, like as shepherds, he talks about Tartars and Arabs, people who are again moving around with the flocks. Most men would also be warriors as well. So there's really no kind of division of labor, so to speak. And remember we talked about division of labor with Smith. Not a lot of specialization there. Okay. Now with agriculture, this is this time when you've got some distinctions within the society, particularly among men, in terms of being a soldier, being a warrior, being a fighter for your society. If you're an older person, an older male, you're not going to be fighting, and so you're responsible for keeping things straight back home. Okay, and so he says on page 291, it became necessary to pay those who take the field, since artificers and manufacturers must be maintained by the public when away from their work. So you think about the Roman army, for example. One of the tensions that ended up being created when the republic becomes an empire is that before, the only people who could actually be in the Roman army were property owners, people who worked the land and owned the land. Well, if you're taking them off and fighting all these different wars and expanding your territory, who's going to take care of the farm? And so sooner than later, what ends up happening is that you end up having to have a professional military. And so if you're going to have a professional military, and these are duties that are so great, and there's a whole theory of economics that talks about market failure. And so, most economic enterprises, especially private ones in a free economy, they're designed to make a profit. But then there are certain types of activities that are so expensive, and a lot of them have what we call high fixed capital costs. So let's say thinking about the army of Adam Smith's time, a cannon. What's the market? What's the private marketplace for cannons? I mean, there might be a private market for rifles, but for cannons, you're going to have a cannon in your yard as a farmer or something like that. Probably not going to happen. And so, if you don't have cannon and you're a country, and someone else does, and their government is using their tax dollars to pay for cannon, well, you better too. And so that market failure, or that feature of the market that's not going to make it profitable to produce cannons for the private market, the government's going to have to step in and kind of fix that market failure and provide public funding. Do you understand that? So that's so if there's market failure and that this is a duty of the government, then the government's going to need to actually step in. Now, how they deliver that product is a whole different notion. So if you think about the modern American military machine, the federal government is not producing the F-16 jet fighter. Boeing is. Now we're taking tax dollars that are collected from everybody, and then there is a bidding process where Boeing is going to try to get a contract in order to provide, let's say, 50 F-16s at 500 million a pop or 30 million a pop, however much they are, right? Millions and millions of dollars per aircraft. So that's a huge industry, isn't it? And the government is paying for it, but they're not making it. The private companies are, and then the other companies are kind of, McDonnell Douglas is another defense contractor, private company. They're getting public contracts, but they are innovating. They're the ones that are creating these weapon systems and not the government. So even though it's a duty of government, what Smith would say, how you provide it and how you deliver the goods, there could be a big role for private companies in terms of delivering public goods. Private, public. Okay. All right. He talks again. We're back to war here, and he says that as you get more division of labor and you get more manufacturing and you get more invention, and you think about some of the greatest technological advancements, many of them come from the military. And this desire to either defend yourself or to actually project military power. A lot of scientific and technological advancements have been created just for that effect. Okay, now sometimes there's spillover effect. I mean, the famous story about the internet. Poor Al Gore, he did not invent the technology for the internet, so he's wrong there. But he was on the Armed Services Committee when commanders in the field in the American military were asking for technology that would help them inter-network, basically communicate with other bases and installations. Let's say you're a commander in Europe and you want to talk to your counterpart in Southwest Asia. They wanted a way of doing that without having to pay long distance charges. Well, they created a inter-network, a computer network, to talk with each other without having to go over the telephone line. Well, that's the birth of the internet and the birth of email and electronic communications and so on and so forth. So there are spillover effects when it comes to these type of things. So anyway, technological innovation is a big part of the advancement of warfare. And so when you get to the point where you're in opulent, technologically complex societies, with the invention of firearms, this is on page 292, now, there was always a part of military training where, a big value added was, training, dexterity, strength, skill. In the military, I was part of this. You had to be physically fit. You had to be out in the field. You had to know how to conduct ambushes and raids and deliberate assaults and all of that kind of stuff, and do it in night and day and hot and cold and all of that stuff. Well, that's not to say that of course this is the 21st century, or I was fighting in the 20th century. Well, still, the invention of firearms is the great equalizer among military today, and so that physical skills and strength and agility are important, but so is being able to fire a M16. And how about a multiple launch rocket system? Or how about a Tomahawk missile from an aircraft carrier, right? You don't have to be as physically fit as, let's say, one of the 300 in Sparta and be able to press a button and and you know send a cruise missile to its target. And so what he says is that actually regularity, order, and prompt obedience to command are the qualities which in modern armies are more important toward determining the fate of battles than the dexterity and skill of the soldiers and use of their arms. So I think it's a pretty important point. It sounds like an obvious observation, but I think it's an important one. And so as these uh, toys, these weapon systems become more complex, they become more expensive, and therefore a larger and larger part of any government's budget, which means if you're going to have a public expenditure, you're going to have to figure out a way of paying for it. And so remember on Tuesday we're going to be talking about taxes, and so he's going to have some things to say about that. So that's the first duty, he says on page 293, of the sovereign is defending the society against violence and also internal violence. You think about the dangers that we have during this coronavirus of looting and pillaging and people kind of doing stupid, dumb stuff. And so it's the job of the society to protect and defend. And so that kind of feeds into the second function of government, which is to provide for justice, criminal justice, administration of justice. Basically, how he explains it, protecting every member of the society from the injustice or oppression of every other member of it. And so, you've got this idea of I'm going to give up some of my rights, quit the state of nature, remember Locke, and move into civil society. At which point, I need an independent arbiter. I need an umpire, a judge, to resolve disputes when my rights intervene and conflict with somebody else's. Okay, and so again, he does the same kind of thing here. That it's pretty, in a hunter-gatherer society, you might have one chieftain that is going to make rulings on these areas, but there's not going to be a terrible amount of written law and statutes and precedent and all of that kind of stuff. Okay. Now he says though, and this is a question that I've asked you. What makes the administration of civil justice and civil society important, and what kind of leads to the development and establishment of it? Well, it's just like Locke. And what's the answer? Property. Okay, this is in the middle of 294. The acquisition of valuable and extensive property, therefore, necessarily requires the establishment of civil government. Where there is no property, or at least none that exceeds the value of 2 or 3 days' labor, civil government is not so necessary. But where it is, you need it. Okay, and he's going to go on to say that really, in particularly in opulent societies, really civil government is there to protect the rich from the poor, because there's more poor than rich, and if they gang up on the rich people, they can take their property away from them, and that's a form of injustice. Okay, so now again, he's gonna track this from kind of uncivilized society or less civilized society to more civilized. So he talks about the circumstances of subordination. So what that means is there's kind of like a pecking order in society, and you're going to need rules and laws and statutes and criminal enforcement mechanisms as people become more unequal. Madison in Federalist 10 says, there's all sorts of reasons why we have factions, but the most durable of them is the unequal distribution of property. So the so-called haves and the have-nots. And so really the job of government is to regulate those factions and to keep them at bay. So when you look at these conflicts, these subordinations where people are kind of more than somebody else, that are subordinate to somebody else. That's what he's talking about here on page 294. So the first one is superiority of personal qualifications. So this is just, people are smarter, people are stronger, people are better looking. And so those distinctions are going to render people subordinate to others. He talks about wisdom, virtue, prudence, justice, fortitude, strengths of the mind. A strong man who by mere strength of body can force two weak ones to obey him. All right, and so the people who obey, they get the people that are obeyed, they get to make the rules for the society. He says the second subordinate as causes of subordination is age. I'm not sure it's that way anymore, but you'd hope that there's still kind of a common sense and idea that if you're older and been around the block a little bit more, that you're kind of owed a certain deference, and that we want people who make our laws to have some experience, and with age, we hope you get more experience, right? He says the third cause is superiority of fortune. So again, wealthy people having more, being able to, I wouldn't call it rig the system, although sometimes that certainly does happen, but more that they're able to, you know, work their will and make sure that there are laws in place that benefit them. And here he kind of draws some distinctions between the kind of the less civilized and more civilized societies. You know, so if you've got a society that's based on animal husbandry and shepherds, he says the Tartar chief, the increase of his herds and flocks is sufficient to maintain 1,000 men, cannot well employ that increase in any other way than in maintaining 1,000 men. The rude state of his society does not afford him any manufactured produce, any trinkets or baubles of any kind. He is necessarily both their general and their judge, and his chieftainship is the necessary effect of the superiority of his fortune. So he not only is wealthy, but he's the one that they're going to go to resolve disputes that might pop up. Now, when you get richer and the society gets richer, yeah, you're going to have more people who are wealthy, but they're going to have control of less and less of the society. So anyway, you're going to have inequality. That inequality is going to in some way be spread out across the society. Okay, so he says that he says that there is no period accordingly in which authority and subordination are more perfectly established than in a shepherd society. And the final cause of subordination is the superiority of birth, which has something to do with fortune, but here we're talking about aristocracy, right? With these noble families that have been able to keep their fortunes in the hands of their eldest sons and have passed it down, and that nobility of birth has given them the authority to administer justice. Okay, he says that page 296, the distinction of birth is not present among hunters, but always among shepherds. And 297, he says it's in the age of shepherds that in the second period of society that the inequality of fortune first begins to take place and introduces among men a degree of authority and subordination which could not possibly exist before. And then on the bottom of the page, he talks about that point that really civil government is designed to protect the rich from the poor. Civil government, so far as instituted for the security of property, is in reality instituted for the defense of the rich against the poor, or of those who have some property against those who have none at all. Okay, so that's the second function of government, which is to administer justice. Okay, the third category, and he's going to get into at least some of them now, although the next section is going to be about education, and that's another public institution. He says that the third duty is public works, okay, and public works which are useful but not capable of bringing in a profit to individuals. So again, this is the idea of market failure again. And so these are public works that help people with their private employments and their private economic lives. So if you think about, we're talking about uh, a new piece of legislation. They're already talking about a new infrastructure bill. This has been something that's actually been on the agenda for quite a while. Trump wanted it at the beginning, and the Democrats have wanted it. But because of all of the sparring and fighting over impeachment and all that, they haven't been able to get it together. It seems like this crisis is actually going to be an impetus for a not a rescue bill for businesses that have been closed down artificially by the government, but this is something about putting people to work, maybe people who've lost their work today, but also maybe other people who, needed the job even before this time. And so they're talking about public works. Well, think about items on the agenda is establishing 5G networking all across the United States, which would require basically building these transmission lines that have higher fiber optic capabilities, more satellites, all of that kind of stuff, which takes a lot of money and a lot of expense. So a lot of these infrastructure projects are ones that one of their economic features is that they have high fixed capital costs. A road, a bridge, a railroad track, airline engines for planes. These things cost a ton of money. And so part of the problem, railroads would be, this is a good example to make. Um, why isn't there competition? Because, part of the beauty of the free market is that if you have competition among firms, prices go down and quality goes up. It's when you have monopolies that you don't. Well, there are so-called natural monopolies that occur when there are, products that take a lot of capital investment at the outset. So if you're laying railroad track, it takes a lot of labor and a lot of steel and a lot of lumber, and a lot of tools. Um, and if you run into a mountain, you got to blow a hole in the mountain. So you can build one of those things, but okay, well, we want competition, so we want a second railway. Well, is there enough capital in the economy, let alone in the government, to be able to build a second one to have these kinds of competitions? Well, oftentimes there weren't, and so what ended up happening is you get a monopoly, these railroad companies. And what was happening in the late 19th century is that they were charging exorbitant rates to farmers to get their goods to market, and they weren't doing a really good job. They weren't on time, and all of the rest. So there was a need to regulate that market, and so you get the Interstate Commerce Commission as a beginning stab at regulating these monopolies. So that's part of the reason why Smith would say you need government to kind of go in and equalize things. So he first talks about public works that are for facilitating commerce in a general fashion. And so these are, some of them that are obviously still around. He talks about public roads must evidently increase with the annual produce of the land and labor of that country, or with the quantity and weight of the goods which becomes necessary to fetch and carry upon those roads. So you need more roads, and roads that don't that are easy to use. Um, if you think about how we convey goods and services, trucking, railroads. If you're in the middle part of the country, use that Mississippi River to go north and south. That's still a big part of that. Bridges. Bridges are very important. Strength of a bridge must be suited to the number and weight of the carriages. And so you also have to inspect these bridges. One of the big complaints about our bridges today is that they haven't been really upgraded for a long, long time, and there's a worry that some of them might break. And so maybe there's and governments have to inspect these to make sure that they're not. But you also need money to pay the inspectors to do this kind of thing. It talks about canals, dredging harbors for navigable rivers and streams and harbors and all of the rest. He says that in terms of paying for it, the expense of those public works should be defrayed from the public revenue as it is commonly called, of which the collection application in most countries is assigned to the executive power. So basically tax dollars. But then there are some ways that you can pay for these things, which we might call a user fee. So the classic example is a toll. A highway, a bridge, a navigable canal, for example, may in most cases be made and maintained by a small toll upon the carriages. So it's a user fee. Actually, the gas tax is a user fee. If you're going to use the roads and you're going to use an automobile, you go to the pump, over half of a gallon of gas is taxes to pay for certain infrastructure and all the rest. How about with the post office? That's a public work, facilitating communication and business across state lines. That's important, and you pay a fee, don't you? You pay a stamp. Um, but he also says that you need to make a distinction between public works that are for the entire country and public works that are just for a locality. So, for example, you might have a local road, a state road, a county road, and they're going to have different jurisdictions, and they're going to be paid out of different pots of taxpayer money. Okay, so those are general public works that he wants the government to be responsible for. But again, he's flexible in terms of how you pay for it and how it's delivered. Finally, the last topic here is there are particular branches of commerce that might need their own specific public work. So here, a lot of this has to do with not manufacturing and not agriculture. This is more about foreign commerce. So let's say you're trying to, do business in China. Well, you need someone to help protect that businessman or that industry or that firm that is doing business overseas. So you're going to need an embassy. You're going to need forts and garrisons to actually have some soldiers there in order to protect you. You might need an embassy to protect you from if there's like civil disturbances in that particular country. Um, let's see here. You might need uh, ambassadors and other public ministers. Let's see, on page 300, he says, um, it seems not unreasonable, this is the last paragraph on 300, that the extraordinary expense which the protection of any particular branch of commerce may occasion should be defrayed by a moderate tax upon that particular branch, by a moderate fine, for example, would be paid by the traders when they first entered into it. So this would be something like the East India Company paying a tax to the government, and then the government will turn and use that fee to help build an embassy or a garrison or a a fort in an area abroad. Okay. Now last question talks about what are some of the problems when a joint stock company is granted even a temporary monopoly. So this is on the top of 301. He says the joint stock companies which have had the one right have consistently exercised the other, and that right is to actually run the forts themselves. Companies misuse the right of making peace and war. So really, the East India Company was governing parts of India. It wasn't the English government. And the problem was they unjustly, capriciously, and cruelly exercised those powers. He says that it's too well known from recent experience. So he's got a problem with just having the government give companies the ability to defend themselves. This was the Hudson Bay Company was the same way in the 16th and 17th, well, really the 17th and 18th centuries in Canada. You know that Smith's not a big fan of monopoly, and so he's going to say he's not going to change his tune here. He says, by a perpetual monopoly, all the other subjects of the state are taxed very absurdly in two different ways. First, by the high price of goods, which in the case of a free trade they could buy much cheaper, and secondly, by their total exclusion from a branch of business, which it might be both convenient and profitable for many of them to carry on. So not only do you have a problem with doing this foreign trade sometimes and conferring governmental powers to a company, you also, by creating a monopoly, you're going to distort the markets there as well. And this just gets back to his overall concern that the English government, the British government, was too involved with empire and not enough with just promoting trade and peace across the globe. All right, I think that's what I've got. All right, so I think you'll be able to answer the questions from that. Again, the homework for the second session is page 302 to 311, where we'll talk about education. Just wanted to show you a couple of pictures here. I'll set them up for you. It says, legitimate expenses of the sovereign include the cost of a standing army and developing sophisticated firepower. Old-style militias, argues Smith, are no longer adequate for developed economies. So there's a satirical view of the militia of the city of London, and then a looking at the Prussian military, then the making of rifles in France and artillery in the Low Countries. So these are, again, some pictures of what Smith would say. You know, the top picture is a bad way of providing that public expense, a public good, and the bottom is a better way of doing it. And then it says it's the sovereign's duty to fund public works, especially transport facilities, private enterprise, and manufacturing. So roads, bridges, and docks. So again, this is another picture of what Smith would say is the proper and legitimate use of government money. So again, Smith is not, and here's tolls and turnpikes, right? So again, this is how you would go about paying for this. Okay, so that's all I have. I will be back shortly to talk about education. But until then, talk to you soon. Thank you.